Azul GG, welcome to the channel. We had to finish the trifecta. We've had Hearthstone, we've had MTG, and now we have to have the master of Pokemon. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Excited to be here. For sure.
Good. I think a lot of the Pokemon fans are probably going to be excited to hear your opinions on some Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for the people who may not know who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Azul GG. I create Pokemon TCG, more competitive content, and I'm also a competitor in the game still as well. Been playing since 2009, 2010 time, so quite a while that I've been playing the Pokemon TCG. Racked up a decent amount of accomplishments. I won 2 majors last season. Probably going to take a little bit of a step back from competing, going to this next season, focus a little bit more on content, but yeah, I'm excited to be here and guess some Yu-Gi-Oh cards.
He's so humble as he talks about all of his great accomplishments. I think you're underselling yourself a bit, but I think we're all excited to see what a Pokemon player thinks about the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game. I know I am, because to be fair, while you may know a little bit about Yu-Gi-Oh, you told me you understand the fundamental basics. You've played a little bit of GOAT format. I know very little about Pokemon TCG. I've actually had a few people who know something about the game help me provide this list of cards to you just because they thought it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. So I'm excited to get into it, and we're going to take it easy on you for the first one here. I'm going to show you a card that you should be familiar with because it is, in fact, in GOAT format.
Okay, yeah, I've definitely seen this one before. Graceful Charity, draw 3 cards from your deck, then discard any 2 cards from your hand.
So what I want you to evaluate is a few things here. How we're going to rate you today is I want you to talk about this in the context of Pokemon, obviously, because I think that's what a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh side of the audience is interested to hear. And then I want you to tell us if you think this card is good or bad, and then after that, if you think this card was ever banned at any point throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history.
Okay, so as far as a Pokemon card would go, it would depend on what would be limiting it. So in Pokemon, we have trainer cards, which I guess like you could compare to like spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh or Magic. And we have 2 different types though, like different speeds in those games. There's supporters, which you can play once per turn, and then there's item cards, which you can play as many as you want.
Interesting.
So
okay.
If this was a supporter card, it would be terrible. If this was an item card, it would be good in aggressive decks. I think this would probably be like the best aggressive item card we've ever seen. With the couple that would be like similar to this that we've seen in the past, there was a card called Acrobike. You look at the top 2, discard 1, take 1. And then current format, we have Trekking Shoes, which is look at the top card. You may discard it or take it. If you discard it, you draw the next card. So this would be probably the most powerful version of those 2 cards ever. This card would actually maybe just be this card would just be a 4 of an everything, to be honest. If it was in Pokemon as an item card. In Yu-Gi-Oh terms, in my knowledge of Yu-Gi-Oh and how good draw power is, just seeing more cards, even if it is like this is like effectively a +1 to your hand, but you get to choose any 2 cards to discard either from the new cards or the old cards. So that gives you like a decent amount of control over what you see. So in something like Pokemon, this isn't like super high value, but honestly, if this was in Pokemon as an item card, it would maybe be a 4 of. In Yu-Gi-Oh though, this does seem extremely strong. So I definitely think this is a pretty good card.
Okay. Now, do you think it was banned at any point or not?
I'm gonna go ahead and say yes, because it does seem just kind of ridiculous. What is so this is just a spell. You could just play, if you have this in your hand, you could just play it, right? There's no restriction to this. Yeah, I would say. And you could play 3 of these theoretically, right?
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah, so I would say this has probably got banned at some point. This is a little bit too good.
You're correct. I started you off easy. Graceful Charity. It's interesting because from my little understanding of Pokemon, I know you guys have some like ridiculous draw power. I've seen a couple cards before that like in Yu-Gi-Oh standards would actually just break my brain. So I was curious what a card like Graceful Charity would be like in Pokemon because, you can't like draw 7 or anything like that in Yu-Gi-Oh. There's a few cards that maybe let you do that, but none of them are... They have so many restrictions that they would never actually resolve. So it's interesting to hear that even a card like as powerful as it is for us Yu-Gi-Oh players, that in Pokemon, under the right context, this card would actually be incredibly strong there, even though you guys have even better draw cards as well. So correct. You are on the board. Really cool to hear your insight. I am excited to see how some of the rest of these go. All right. So next up, we're going to show you something that is something you might not be used to in Pokemon from my understanding. So why don't you go ahead and give this card a read.
All right. Effect Veiler. During your opponent's main phase, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to select one of your face-up effect monsters your opponent controls. Negate the effects of that monster until the end phase. During your opponent's main phase, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. One face-up effect monster your opponent controls. Negate the effects of that monster until your end phase. So it's kind of like a counter spell for effects on the monster. instead of like a spell.
Effectively, no pun intended, yes, that is what this is for. But the monster does stay on the field. It's only negating the effects. And now, from my understanding, you can clarify this. Pokemon is you play out your turn, your opponent plays out their turn. There isn't interaction during the other player's turn, correct?
Yeah, exactly. We've only had one card ever back in 2010, 2011, that you could, if you had enough Pokemon of a certain type in play, you could play it during your opponent's turn to stop. It's kind of similar to this. We had Poke Powers, where it's like it's a power a Pokemon can use either when it comes into play or once per turn usually, and you could prevent it with that card.
How good was that card?
It was pretty good. It was like some of the best decks. The Pokemon you had to have in play was called an SP Pokemon. If you had 3 SP Pokemon in play, you could play it from your hand during your opponent's turn. And the SP decks were some of the most powerful decks in the format. So the card was pretty good. And it actually, so it's almost literally this. It was called Power Spray. Power Spray is literally this card, it feels like.
But this doesn't have any restrictions.
No restrictions. The restriction wasn't really hard to meet that restriction. It was mostly to like tone it down for the first turn of the game. So it was unlikely you'd be able to play it on the first turn of the game, but at past turn 1 you'd be able to play it pretty consistently. This you can just kind of play whenever. The thing I'm not sure about is just like how powerful are effects on monsters.
So you think by Pokemon standards this would be really good though? Yeah,
by Pokemon standards, this would be really good. This would be very, very good by Pokemon standards, for sure. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, this feels less powerful overall. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I don't think this card is great.
And so if you don't think it's great, do you think it was ever banned? I'm assuming no.
Yeah, I'd have to go. I guess there could be a card that wasn't that great, but like the perfect, everything perfectly lines up for it to be banned. But I'm going to go ahead and say this card was never banned.
You're 1 for 1. You didn't get this one. Effect Veiler is actually an incredibly strong card. As Yu-Gi-Oh! Has progressed, monster effects have essentially become the most powerful aspect of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. Coming from like with your background with GOAT and everything like that, I could see why you might think that, the spell cards have like some of the most powerful effects, especially when you look at something like Graceful Charity by comparison, right?
Yeah.
But Effect Veiler is strong for numerous reasons. This card was actually released, I want to say like 2011, around that era. So it's about midway through Yu-Gi-Oh!'s lifespan at this point. And even on release, Effect Veiler was still an incredibly powerful card and still is today for numerous reasons. So being able to negate effects in any capacity by Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards, both older or newer, is really strong because a lot of the best effects in the game as it's gotten older are harbored in the monster effects, and basically being able to cut your opponent off is really good. Also, with Effect Veiler, it doesn't say that you can only use 1 copy of Effect Veiler per turn. So hypothetically, if your opponent has a play, you use an Effect Veiler to stop that play. If they have a follow-up play to try to continue out their turn, if you hypothetically have multiple copies of Effect Veiler in your hand, you can stop multiple things. And as Yu-Gi-Oh's gotten older, you mentioned the item cards and the supporter cards. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has started to slap a lot of once per turn effects on types of cards that might be similar to this. And so Effect Veiler being printed earlier on wasn't subject to that once per turn restriction. And so there are other versions of Effect Veiler that are in Yu-Gi-Oh! That have that restriction, which make it infinitely worse than Effect Veiler as a result. And so this card actually, even to this very day, still sees modern play. It's still that good.
Okay. So it was banned, or it is banned in what, standard? Is modern different? What is modern? How does modern different from standard?
So in Yu-Gi-Oh, we just have one format. It's an eternal format. You can play cards all the way from the very beginning in 2002, assuming they're not banned anymore. Effect Veiler was never banned.
That's right.
Yeah, Effect Veiler was never banned and is actually still at 3 copies. It was never. Okay. I don't think it ever touched the limited list at all. I believe it's just a very well-designed card. Also, some other things too that may not necessarily matter for the purposes of our video, but the fact it's a tuner means you can access synchro monsters. Being a light attribute is very relevant as well for a lot of decks. It's a very just well-rounded card for what it does. It's not going to necessarily win the game by itself, but it's going to help you win in a lot of cases. And so that's why it still sees tons of play today.
Makes sense. Yeah, for some reason I forgot that Yu-Gi-Oh! Only is the one format. Because in my head I was thinking, in Pokemon we do have 2 formats. We have standard and expanded. Expanded basically doesn't get played anymore. They play it a little bit over in Japan still, but the format's got kind of out of control, and I feel like it's not well maintained in terms of like ban lists. And we don't have restrictions in Pokemon. They never like say you can only play 3 copies or 2 copies or 1 copy of the card.
Sure. But you also have rotation though, so that's
So our standard format is very, very much fine. And
technically, Yu-Gi-Oh! Does have 2 formats. We have advanced format, which is our eternal format, and then we have traditional format, which is the same format, but any card that's banned is actually legal at 1, but no one plays traditional format. I don't know why they just haven't just erased that from existence, because it hasn't literally been played since like 2003, I want to say. So, but they still call it that, so whatever. Anyway, next card. Let's see if we can get you back on the board here with this one.
All right, Swords of Revealing Light. Flip all monsters your opponent controls face up. This card remains on the battlefield or on the field for 3 of your opponent's turns. While this card remains on the field, monsters your opponent controls cannot declare an attack. Well, that's interesting. So that definitely is going to slow them down quite a bit.
And combat's very important in Pokemon because, I mean, it's Pokemon, I imagine, at least.
Flip all monsters your opponent controls face up. That's like another thing I actually don't understand too deeply about Magic. The whole process of different kinds of summoning is something I'm missing. Oh, I said Magic. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Is something I'm missing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like the whole process of summoning synchro summons and all that kind of stuff. I don't quite fully understand that stuff. Another thing I don't have a great grasp on in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is face up or face down cards. When when you set them face down.
So I'll give you some context if the audience hasn't just canceled you for calling our game Magic. But so with the first part of the effect, I will let you know for the purposes of this video is probably irrelevant. It's more so the attack stopping capabilities. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, you're allowed to once per turn as a normal summon, either set a monster in face down defense position or normal a monster in face up attack position. The reason you want to set a monster in face-down defense position is some monsters have what are called flip effects, which means if they get flipped either from being attacked or if you choose to manually flip those cards up, it will do something. And those effects, because of the mysteriousness of and the unknown information of not knowing what that set monster is, same thing can be applied to back row that are set face-down as well. Your opponent might play differently trying to play around certain cards. If in the format there are certain cards that are very well known for being played, if that makes sense.
Setting you can't just set anything though, right? It has to be a card that would be able to be set because there's some monsters that can only come into play through like special summoning things, right?
Correct. So unless like the card says special summon the monster in face down defense position, which very few cards do, special summonings do not happen in face down defense position. So you'd have to normal set the monster as your normal summon for that turn.
Okay, makes sense. All right, remains on the field for 3 of your opponent's turns. While this card remains on the field, monsters your opponent controls cannot declare an attack. I mean, that just seems pretty good. Like I don't know, this seems like a good card. I don't know. The thing that I guess I have a little bit of a hang up on with this one is like, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, when you attack, you have to go through the monsters first, correct? Like, it's
correct.
Correct. Okay. I guess that makes
How would this be in Pokemon?
How would this be in Pokemon? I'd be really good in Pokemon because you could just you would be able to just because there's no defense stat, so you can't take damage back when you punch your opponent's Pokemon.
Sure.
Sure. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's different, right? When you attack into one of your opponent's monsters, you're going to take damage back to your monster, right? Your monster is going to get hit as a response.
So the monsters don't retain damage. It's bigger number wins. But in the instance of if your monster attacks a bigger monster your opponent has, either an attack or defense, you take that damage to your life points. It doesn't go onto the monster like Pokemon.
Okay. Yeah, so you're still going to have to go through your opponent's monsters anyways. So the hang up I have is like, how much does it matter that your opponent can't attack if you have to go through their monsters anyways? But I would still have to assume that it's pretty good that your opponent loses control of being able to attack. So I'm gonna say this card is pretty good. Good enough that it was banned or is banned. How often is there a was banned situations? Like a card was banned but is now no longer banned?
That happens like pretty, I don't want to say frequently, but there are plenty of instances where a card was maybe banned in old Yu-Gi-Oh! And now by modern standards, it's not very good. I would say that's the most common instance.
Okay, so good card, banned.
So Swords of Revealing Light's a really funny card. This is actually one of the first cards ever printed in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's from the anime. I'm not sure if you ever watched it. It's okay if you didn't. It's nothing special, but it's part of our childhood.
I watched a little bit when they were doing the whole thing on Twitch, where they had like the whole Yu-Gi-Oh! Marathon going on.
Yugi actually uses this against Kaiba in the very first episode. And Swords of Revealing Light, gameplay speaking, was quite strong back in the day. It effectively just said draw 3 cards and your opponent can't attack you for 3 turns. And there was very few ways to actually remove the swords. So the fact that you just got to buy as much time as possible, and not to mention your opponent could also play this, the games would drag on really long as a result. And just ended up being an extremely good card. But as the game aged, there were more ways and more tools to be able to deal with Swords of Revealing Light. And over time, just as the game evolved, it became less combat focused, I want to say, where like the stats really didn't matter because a lot of the time you might just get one big push to kill the opponent. So I don't want to say Swords is a bad card. It's actually very funny because in Master Duel, our online client, this card gets awarded to people for free, like just basically for making an account. And to this day, there are still clips of people like losing to Swords of Revealing Light against like newbie decks because they don't have like an answer to it. And so like the newbie deck might have enough time to like do something to fight back. So it's still kind of an annoying card, even though like it's not like a playable card by modern standards. I wouldn't say the card is bad in the slightest, if that makes sense, but it was never banned. So you got it right that it was good, but it wasn't banned. So you get a half point for that one. You get a half point for that one.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Interesting to hear about like the Pokemon perspective on this, though. My one friend suggest this card because he thought this would be broken by Pokemon standards.
Yeah, it definitely would be broken in Pokemon because there's no for attacking your Pokemon to your opponent's Pokemon. There's no negative effect for doing that ever. So
do you have a card that like you play and it just stays on the field like active, like a continuous type effect?
Yeah, so there are stadium cards in Pokemon. There's actually a stadium card that's kind of similar. I guess like you could maybe say it's kind of similar to this that just released in the most recent set, and it says any of your non-rule box Pokemon, and the rule box Pokemon are like the bigger Pokemon worth multiple prize cards. Any of your non-rule box Pokemon cannot be damaged by rule box Pokemon.
Interesting. That is similar. Yeah.
So as long as it stays in play, you're like all your non-rule box Pokemon are fully protected for theoretically forever, but people play other stadium cards. The stadium slot in Pokemon is like something you share with your opponent. There's only ever one stadium card in play. Okay. So if you play one, your opponent on their turn can either play a stadium or use a different effect of a different card to remove the stadium from play.
So if you play your own stadium, does that remove the opponent's stadium?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, we have what's called the Field Zone. It's very similar, but actually several years back, they changed the rule where both players can now have a field spell active. And field spells became very centralizing in a lot of archetypes for making the deck function, which is why they changed that rule. So it's interesting that you guys still have the old version of how that used to work for us. It's pretty funny. Let us move on. I have a trap card to show you. I don't have too many of these because I know you don't have like too many ways to interact with the opponent on their turn. So I wanted to keep this a bit limited here, but I like this one for Pokemon specifically.
Rivalry of Warlords. Each player can only control one type of monster. Send all other face-up monsters they control to the graveyard. So what would be a type? Type
is so in Yu-Gi-Oh we have types and attributes. So if you look back at the effect veiler, the type would be a spellcaster in the text box, and the attribute would be the top right corner. That's a light monster. So type in this case would be you could only, in the instance of effect veiler, you could only have spellcasters on your side of the field.
So obviously if you played this card, your deck would be built around it, so it's not going to be too big of a negative effect for you, maybe slightly depending on what other types you have in your deck. So you're really trying to utilize this against your opponent. It feels like this would be like, I guess like, so what is my question, my thought process is going to, what is the average composition of a Yu-Gi-Oh deck? How often is it only one type of monster, or are your main monsters all the same type? Like the couple big ones you want to have in play, if they're all the same type.
The way I can answer that, obviously without trying to give you the answer completely, it really just depends on the format and the way that people are building decks. It could be that maybe the best deck is comprised of all of one type of monster. It could be that it's comprised of several different types, because maybe the archetype is either all spellcasters, or maybe it's like a duo of like spellcasters and beasts, hypothetically. Or maybe it's like a tri-focused archetype where it's like spellcasters, beasts, and warriors. So it really kind of depends, because Yu-Gi-Oh is an eternal format and there's so many cards. People might find random cards that synergize with their deck, even though it may not necessarily be something that makes sense on paper. It's kind of a roundabout cop-out answer, but that's like the best way I can really answer it for you.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like in terms of Pokemon standards, this would be really good, because most decks have multiple different types of powerful Pokemon they want in play.
Gotcha. That's what I was curious about. I wasn't sure if Pokemon was like solely like, by gym leader, Pokemon Game Boy standards. Like, is everyone just playing like a singular type, or do you guys like mix it up? I wasn't too sure on that.
Yeah, usually it's like a little bit mixed up. Like the best deck in the format right now, Regidrago. The main attacker is Dragon type, but the engine of the deck is a grass Pokemon. So you want to have both of them in play constantly. So like someone putting this in play as like a trap card, or like playing as like a supporter or a stadium card or something would be pretty disruptive. like consistently against like every deck. So it would be a pretty common card played. For the knowledge that I have of Yu-Gi-Oh, this feels like it would be a good card, but in terms of like a tech card. So it'd be like a sideboard card or specific metas for specific matchups. But I doubt this card was ever banned. Yeah, so good card. It seems like a good kind of tech card, but it doesn't seem like a card that would be banned.
Well, you're right on the money with this one. So this card has never been banned. Rivalry of Warlords is basically everything that you said. It's a card that I want to say for the most part, people will find ways to cheese this card out into play. There are ways that you could hypothetically like send this card from your deck to the graveyard, then like grab it back. So it's like you're searching it in the roundabout way. To basically stop your opponent from playing the game. Or, like you said, it's a tech card in specific decks because maybe the meta is very predominantly multi-type. So if you play Rivalry of Warlords, it's a way to really stop that. Or it's a stun tool that stun-based strategies will use to just make it so that the opponent is miserable and can't actually play the game whatsoever. It's a card that it's a very old card, as a matter of fact, but it's actually aged now rather poorly. This is what we like to call a floodgate because it is a continuous trap. You can see that by the infinity symbol next to where it says trap card. So this card stays active until someone interacts with it to remove it from the field in some way. And just the fact that the way the game has sort of progressed, these types of floodgate effects that just prevent the opponent from actually playing the game. Most of the time when cards like this, there are similar ones that do similar things. When these cards are played, they just feel really bad to play against because it's like your opponent will do a thing and then flip Rivalry, and now all of a sudden I can't even like try to play the game because this one card hoses my deck. So as a matter of fact, this card is limited currently, and a lot of people are actually calling out for this card to be banned. And we have a ban list not too long after the time of recording this video, so maybe it will be banned. We'll see.
What is it limited to? Or when limits happen, is it always to one, or is there sometimes two ofs?
So we have limits and semi-limits. Limits are the most common. Semi-limits are pretty infrequent, but this card is currently limited to one copy. Yes, which makes it even sackier, right? Because if your opponent has the one copy, then it's like, oh great, I lost to the one of. Oh, fun. I imagine that's like when you guys prize card, your one of card that you really don't want to.
Yeah. That's how it is, like kind of in Pokemon. That's got a good comparison because like in something like Yu-Gi-Oh, you see so many less cards. Who knows if you're able to pull off your strategy or find your tech card? In Pokemon, you can always find your tech card or execute your strategy unless you draw fairly poorly, unless it's prize, of course. The prize cards are the things that can get involved.
And you just said you draw a lot of cards in Pokemon. You're able to see a lot of cards. I'm curious what you think about this card for that exact reason.
All right. Droll and Lock Bird. If your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand, except during the draw phase, you can send this card from your opponent's hand to the graveyard. For the rest of this turn, neither player can add cards from their deck to their hand. Drawing cards is also considered. It seems pretty good. It is a monster. So wait, when is this has to be in play to prevent that?
No, so you would have this card in your hand, and let's say, so you draw for turn.
Oh, I see it now, yeah.
Let's say, I don't know many Pokemon cards, but like say you activate, one of the cards that lets you draw a million cards, right? So you do that, and then in response, since a card was added from your deck to your hand, because drawing is considered that action as well, I would then activate, after the resolution of us both drawing cards or whatever, I would activate this Droll and Lockbird. And now for the remainder of the turn, neither of us are allowed to add cards from our deck to our hand in any capacity.
When it says for the rest of this turn, it would just mean the rest of your opponent's turn, right?
Correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure on that. That's what I assumed.
Yes.
I mean, that seems pretty good because drawing cards in Yu-Gi-Oh is pretty good. So stopping your opponent from being able to draw cards sounds pretty good. It feels like this would have to go into like some kind of more like control style deck, because this card is also just the same thing as like seeing cards is good for you as well. This card is just like a dead card if your opponent doesn't actually go out of their way to see more cards. So then you just have like a dead card in your hand. Like you can't get value out of this card. I guess is there any way you can just use this card to like summon other monsters in some kind of summoning sequence?
Yeah, in like the worst case scenario, any monster can effectively be used to summon stuff out of the extra deck for one reason or another. I would say more often than not, you would, unless you're like in a really weird position, I feel like that would not be the case. You're typically using it for its effect, but it does have theoretically other utility outside of just the effect of the card.
Well, I'm gonna keep it pretty straightforward here. I'm not gonna overthink this one. Drawing cards is good in Yu-Gi-Oh, so stopping your opponent from drawing cards also seems pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that this card is good and probably good enough to be banned.
What about Pokemon? You didn't really touch on Pokemon too much.
Oh, comparing this to Pokemon? I mean, this would be pretty good in Pokemon. Like if your opponent goes to play like the I don't know, the best draw supporter of all time in Pokemon TCG is Professor's Research. Discard your hand, draw 7 cards. If you could just play this as a response to your opponent playing a research, that'd be broken. So you would in Pokemon, you would just probably play, and every deck basically plays heavy draw supporters. For the most part, some of them are a little bit like cherry pick supporters where you go search your deck for a specific card. Yeah, I would say this would be like a maxed out count in Pokemon probably. If it was an item card, and this would this would be basically an item card in Pokemon. So this would be broken in Pokemon. Thinking about how Yu-Gi-Oh works as well, like I mentioned, I would say good card.
Do you think this is bannable in Pokemon?
Yeah.
Okay.
If it was an item card, so that's like the big. This would have to be an item. Yeah. And to play it during your opponent's turn would also have to be an item card, just for it to make sense. I guess like you could make a supporter card that said you can play this during your opponent's turn, and then you can't play a supporter during your next turn. Actually, that's kind of a good idea. I wonder if they'll ever do that in the future. That'd be kind of cool. Yeah, you can play this supporter card.
Pokemon Company. We're giving you design ideas.
You don't have to play it during your opponent's turn, and then not being able to play a supporter card during your next turn would actually be pretty cool interaction. But yeah, this would be broken in Pokemon for sure as an item card.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you this as well. I know Pokemon, from my understanding, has a lot of draw power. What about like search power? Like to be able to go into the deck to get like specific cards. Is there a lot of that, or is it more just like draw?
There's a lot of that. So like there's like the go-to search card in Pokemon for a long time. Ultra Ball, discard 2 cards from your hand, search your deck for any one Pokemon. Stuff like that.
That's also a lot of the context I think you also need for Droll and Lockbird, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, you're right on the money almost. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, draw power, like you said, is very important. However, compared to Pokemon, even though draw power in Yu-Gi-Oh is extremely good, we don't have a ton of cards that just draw us cards. I would say Yu-Gi-Oh predominantly, by far and away, the way we're getting cards to our hand to just have more cards to play with is by searching them through other cards. So it'll be like, this card gets you this card gets you that card, and so on. So in Yu-Gi-Oh terms, we have Ultra Balls for everything, essentially. And that could be good or bad, depending on like what you want to get out of a card game. But a lot of people like it because it really adds to the consistency of the game. And instead of just hoping you draw those cards, you can actually just directly search them and interact with them that way. And so Droll and Lockbird, again, another relatively old card, came out about the middle of Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, is extremely good. But like you said, you actually pointed it out, it is specific to, at the time, what the best decks are, and if those decks are playing enough draw/search power that this card is going to get enough mileage in order for it to be worth it. Because card advantage-wise, it is inherently a -1. So you're losing a card to prevent your opponent from doing any more actions that would draw or search for the rest of the turn. However, if you're not able to really follow up after the Droll and Lockbird to establish your own position, or just straight up win the game as a result of it, or the decks don't lose hard enough to Droll and Lockbird, then it actually isn't a particularly good card. So this card will weave its way in and out of formats. People kind of look at this as like the oh shit button, where like if the format's really bad, Droll will make its way in. But typically in healthier formats, asterisk, Droll and Lockbird doesn't really see much play, because there's enough healthy interaction that you don't need to have this catch-all for stopping draw power and search power. And so as a result, very good card, but actually not banned at 3 copies.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense for sure.
I do like to hear that this would be bannable in Pokemon, though. That's very funny.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, speaking of weird cards by Pokemon standards, let's see what you think of this one.
All right, Creature Swap. I've definitely seen this card before.
This is a goat card.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense then. This artwork, I've definitely seen this before.
It's very iconic looking, yeah.
Both players select one monster from their respective sides of the field and switch control of those monsters with each other. The selected monsters cannot change their battle positions this turn.
So from my understanding, in Pokemon, you have your active Pokemon, and then you have like a bench of other Pokemon, correct? Let's say for the purposes of evaluating this by Pokemon standards, you could interact with either their active or their bench.
Yeah. So we basically have cards like that. We have Boss's Orders, or we call them Gust Effects, where you can bring something from the bench to the active spot. Because you can only, generally, most attacks only hit your opponent's active Pokemon. So Gust Effects bring up the bench Pokemon into the active spot, and they swap them out, and then now that's the Pokemon you can have access to.
Okay. Now, do you have it that you can take their benched Pokemon?
No, you don't have that one. We don't have that one.
Not yet.
That's true. Yeah, not yet. That would be cool one, though. This one's interesting because you both get to pick, right? You each pick what you're giving to your opponent.
Correct. So you pick yours, and your opponent picks theirs. So you don't get to pick what they give you.
Yeah. So obviously, if you're playing this, you gotta play some really bad monsters that you're going to give to your opponent, right? Either you get to exhaust the effect of it and it has low stats, and then you give it to your opponent. So it would be kind of just take advantage of what they're going to give to you. So it seems, and I said that's like the thing that would have a missing piece of information here. It's just like what does a Yu-Gi-Oh average Yu-Gi-Oh board look like in terms of the monster composition? Is there generally some stragglers, like some pretty weak monsters that were in play, you've exhausted their effects, or you use them to get some other stuff into play? And if that is a constant, then this card seems like it's pretty bad, or maybe very meta specific.
I will say that it might just depend on what decks are playable at any given time. You are somewhat familiar with GOAT format, so I guess I can give you a little bit of context. This card is considered playable by GOAT format standards, if that helps you out at all. I will say that, like, there are situations where both can happen. There are situations where you might have some monsters that you don't care about giving to your opponent, and maybe your opponent has something that's valuable enough for you to want to take. The reverse could also be true. So it really is just dependent on any given format or any given game, for that matter.
The last like thing that I have a little bit of a hang up about would be how easy would it be to tech against this? Because like we even like with the last card we talked about the Droll unlock. Like initially I said good card. I thought it was banned, but I mean the card is not a card, right? If your opponent doesn't interact with their deck, you have like a dead card in your hand, right?
Right.
So with creature swap, it would be like, how far do you have to go out of your way to build your deck to have just kind of not terrible monsters, but monsters you wouldn't mind giving to your opponent? If creature swap is in the if creature swap is a card, like, do we need to go out of our way to include like 6 basically low value monsters to play around creature swap? And that seems like almost too much at the point. But I'm gonna go ahead and say that creature swap is an okay card, but I'm leaning more towards it being like a tech / format specific card, where it's like when there's only good creatures or only good monsters, that's when all of a sudden creature swap becomes like a playable card.
What about by Pokemon standards? You didn't go too into detail about Pokemon, how this card would interact.
I mean, if it was as simple as you pick one of your benched Pokemon and your opponent picks one of their benched Pokemon, and then you switch them. I'm trying to think if there's any like really cool interactions where you could give your opponent something. It would be pretty good because you could give your opponent liabilities, basically. Certain Pokemon are worth more prize cards and have lower HP because they're like support Pokemon or utility Pokemon. Like there's one in the current format, Squawkabilly, has 160 HP. It's a 2-prize Pokemon, which is pretty low HP for a 2-prize Pokemon. But on the first turn of the game, you can discard your hand and draw 6 cards. You can only use it on the first turn of the game. So besides that, it's just a dead card for the rest of the game, basically. So if you could like give your opponent your Squawkabilly, that'd be pretty good. And then you just KO it off their bench and you get 2 prize cards, right? So by Pokemon standards, this card would be pretty good. Maybe not.
Interesting. So your overall assessment saying it's like okay card, not bannable though.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, solid card, not bannable.
And you are right on the money with this. So Creature Swap's a really cool card. Like you said, it does have its shortcomings. If your opponent doesn't have anything for you to take with it, the card is obviously pretty bad. And you're typically going to play this in a deck of cards that you would want to give to your opponent that you're going to receive some value out of. In older Yu-Gi-Oh standards, we call these battle recruiters. What those are is that when they are killed in battle, they would special summon a monster from your deck to the field with some restriction. Maybe it's like a light monster with 1500 or less attack, for instance. So what you would do is you would have a monster, one of those battle recruiters on your field. Your opponent would have something bigger on their side of the field. You would creature swap the monsters, and then if you attack into your own battle recruiter that they now have possession of, that triggers in your graveyard. So now you get to special summon a monster, and now if your opponent's cleared, you get to hit them directly in the face. So you get to get a huge swing because maybe you get their best monster. Your monster replaced itself with another monster, so the -1 of this card ended up becoming net neutral at the end of the day. And you took their best card, so that's pretty good. But like you said, if your opponent doesn't have any monsters, this card just doesn't really do anything. This card's kind of interesting because like a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards now, they target. This card doesn't target. It actually requires both players to choose a monster. And as a result of that, there are cards that have like targeting protection. So it can actually, in weird ways, like circumvent some protection effects because it's like the player choosing it, not like an effect targeting it, which is like a weird like semantic thing. Yeah. And it's just like, it's kind of a neat design, but it was never really like fantastic. It was never like the tier 1 thing you could be doing. But some decks found, cute ways to take advantage of it. By modern standards, this card is unplayable, but it was a cool old card. And I thought by Pokemon standards, especially because you guys have like the active and the bench, there could become some cool stuff that you could do with it. So it was cool to hear your insight on that.
Yeah, definitely. So wait, so you could give your opponent a card that has a recruit effect, and the recruit effect would trigger for you if that card got defeated?
Correct, because the effect triggers when the monster goes to the graveyard, and so when you destroy the monster, even though it's your monster, it comes back to your graveyard, so that you get the benefit of that effect.
Okay.
There was also a card in Goat format, Scapegoat, the namesake of the format, that if your opponent would activate a creature swap, you could chain Scapegoat, so now you have these 4 little goats on the field, and you just give them a goat, and other creature swaps just completely nullified. So that never felt good. That never felt good. It's one of the reasons why this card was very bad.
Makes sense. Yeah, I remember the goats.
You were talking about the little guys. Talking about the little guys. All right, let's move on. You like drawing cards. Let's see what you think about this card.
All right, Guarded Treasure. Activate this card by discarding 5 cards. Draw 2 cards. While this card is on the field, draw 2 cards instead of 1 for your normal draw during your draw phase. How often do you have 5 cards in your hand in Yu-Gi-Oh?
Well, you do start with 5 draw to 6 at the beginning of the game. Yeah. And I will say it is not unlikely in modern Yu-Gi-Oh that you can acquire more cards in your hand or maintain a high amount of cards in your hand, depending on the type of deck that you're playing.
Okay, so this seems too costly. So we're discarding 5 cards to draw 2 cards. While this card is on the field, draw 2 cards instead of 1 for your normal draw during your draw phase. Oh, so it's constant, though.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, that's... but Yu-Gi-Oh! Games are usually pretty short, especially by today's standards, right? Like 3...
And in Pokemon, you just discard your hand and draw 7 after anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Would having a double draw per turn in Pokemon be broken?
It depends how it would... Because the biggest thing with Pokemon, like in comparison, would always be like, how is this in play? So Stadium cards, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, Stadium cards are active for you and your opponent. So anything it does for both of you. So if this was a Stadium card... Let's
say this is a one-sided Stadium card. I don't know what that looks like, but...
That would be okay. It wouldn't be terrible, especially if you're playing like a slower control deck or a kind of stall deck where you're going to be sitting there for like 10-plus turns probably. Then like +1 over 10 turns is pretty good. If there's like an ability on a Pokemon, also probably pretty decent in those kind of decks. The faster decks, it's a little bit too slow. Maybe some of the mid-range decks, it would be okay. So overall, wouldn't be broken in Pokemon, I don't think. Especially with the initial discarding requirement. Like if you had to do that, that would make it tough to want to play this card.
But it would be actually playable.
Yeah, it would find its way. It'd be a niche card in Pokemon.
Sure.
It wouldn't be broken. Okay. A deck or 2 throughout its lifetime in Standard would maybe utilize it. For terms of Yu-Gi-Oh, though, I could see this being okay. Well, the thing is, like, Yu-Gi-Oh games are so short, right? Like, because like the average Yu-Gi-Oh game today is what, 3 or 4 turns?
Yeah. Let's say that's the average of the bell curve. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So 3 or 4 turns. So let's say you open this in your starting hand, play it immediately, discard your other 5. Do you have to discard 5, or what if you have less than 5?
It is a activation requirement to discard 5 cards, so you would have to discard 5.
So have 5, draw for turn, discard all 5. You draw 2 cards. Next turn you draw 2 more. You're at 4. The turn after you'd be at 6. Assuming this is still in play, which I assuming there's ways to remove it, of course. So you'd be at 6. You'd be at +1 over 2 turns. But your options for your immediate turn and your following turn are just less than what you would have started with. So with the idea that the average game is 3 or 4 turns, the only thing would be like, is there like a card that exists that can just put a bunch of chumps in your hand? Just like fill your hand with a bunch of cards somehow, like send this card to the graveyard, search your deck for these 3 cards, put them into your hand. That would combo pretty well with this. I don't know if those cards exist. So overall, this feels like too costly of a requirement. I'm just going to go ahead and say that this card is probably just... Maybe there's like a deck or 2 out there and it's in the lifetime that would have made this card go. So I'm gonna say this card is bad.
You may not know when it comes to modern Yu-Gi-Oh is that one card in Yu-Gi-Oh now, like one monster, can sometimes be all you need to assemble multiple cards onto your field. And then those cards can then further extend into other cards. So like I said, with like the tutorability of a lot of cards, we may not necessarily be drawing cards in our game, but our monsters, and this is why Effect Veiler can be an extremely powerful card. Same thing goes for something like Droll and Lockbird. One monster in our game can do a lot. Like that can just turn into like 3, 4, 5 cards just out of nowhere. And so Guarded Treasure, allowing you to draw 2 cards deeper into the deck on your first turn and on all the turns afterwards when one card can do so much in the game. Yeah, this card sucks. It's really bad. I just had to gas you.
You almost got me.
I almost got you, yeah.
I was following your thought process there. I was like, all right, so if we don't have the broken card, this increases our odds of getting the broken card. We either have the broken card or we play Guarded Treasure and hope we find it. But one card being that broken would be too good. Then that card probably should be banned.
Yeah, Yeah, sure. Let's go with that. Let's go with that. And maybe if we have you back in the future, we'll cover ground there. We're keeping it simple today. But you're right. Guarded Treasure, too costly. Also, if you don't see this like on your first turn, this card's probably going to be unplayable.
Yeah.
And like you said, the games probably don't go long enough for it to be worth it for you to be drawing 2 a turn. Like, it sounds crazy to draw 2 cards a turn. But when you realize, like you said, the length of average Yu-Gi-Oh games and such, it's just not worth it. This was a card from the anime, and this is actually exactly how it worked in the anime, is a fun fact. But in the anime, it seemed really good, but the games went on for like 10 episodes in the anime. So sure, of course it's crazy in the anime. But cool art, if anything. It's got cool art. Okay. That was a fun one. All right, this is also a fun one. I'm curious what you think about this one.
This card cannot be special summoned. This card returns to its owner's hand during the end phase of the turn. It is normal summoned. If this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they discard all cards in their hand during the next draw phase before they draw. This card cannot be special summoned. So it can't, when special summon what is like the definition between like special summon and normal summon? Like, what does that mean? So it can't be...
So each turn, the player's allotted 1 normal summon, which like I said, is you either play something in face-up attack or set it in face-down defense.
Okay.
To summon this card then, since you cannot special summon it, you would have to tribute summon it, which counts as a normal summon. Tribute summoning requires you to sacrifice monsters by sending them to the graveyard to bring this card out to the field. In this case, since Hino-Kagu-Tsuchi is level 8, you would have to sacrifice 2 monsters on your field to summon this guy out to the field. Special summon is anything that is not a normal summon. You can special summon as many times as you want during a turn. As long as there's not a restriction saying that you can only do it once per turn or such, you're allowed to special summon 50 times if you'd like. But that's obviously if your deck is capable of doing that.
Card inflicts battle damage, which would mean just like anything, either to another monster or to the opponent themselves, right?
Correct. Assuming that monster is in attack position. Because if it's in defense position, they don't take any damage.
Yeah. They discard all cards in their hand during the next draw phase before they draw. So they would discard their hand and then draw for turn.
Correct. Yes.
I mean, that's pretty good. The question is just like, how costly is it to get this thing out? In terms of like Pokemon standards, I mean, that would also be pretty good. Yeah, if you could just like punch something and then they discard their whole hand before they draw.
This is a One Punch Man before One Punch Man existed.
Yeah, we do have those. There is those that is possible in Pokemon. Actually, it's not that difficult to like hand lock your opponent.
Okay.
The thing is that the on-board draw support or the cards required to get there usually means they're not very powerful cards. Like there's a new card coming out in the next set that says if it evolved during this turn, your opponent discards a card for the attack. If you evolved during this turn, your opponent discards 2 cards or 3 cards. Many different ways to get your opponent down to a 3-card hand, so you can basically wipe their hand. But the card doesn't have like a good attack after that. So you hand lock your opponent to 0 cards, but if they have onboard draw support from Pokemon with abilities, or if they just have attackers set up, you have to deal with those still. So
now, how important is discarding cards like out of your opponent's hand in Pokemon though, when you guys have a lot of draw power to sort of like recover after something like this would take place?
Not that important most of the time. Yeah, it's not that important.
But what if it's the whole hand, like with Hino-Kagu-Tsuchi?
Yeah, if it's the whole hand and like, I mean, 2800, 2900 seems pretty decent for stats, right? Like in the...
You have 8,000 life points, so that's almost, you're over a quarter of their life points.
Yeah, exactly. So the stats seem decent. Yeah. So my biggest question is like, how easy is it to negate one monster from your opponent's side of the field? Are they looking out for this? And how difficult is it to get this thing into play? It doesn't seem that difficult, to be honest. And discarding your opponent's whole hand seems good. So I'm gonna say this card is good and probably was banned. Yeah, I'll lock it in.
So Hino-Kagu-Tsuchi is a really fun card. It's really cool. This card was actually playable, funny enough, because you said you know a little bit about GOAT format. I wouldn't say this was like the best thing you could be doing in GOAT format, right? But it's like, it's a deck. You could conceivably, because GOAT format is like slow enough at times, you could one-shot your opponent with this and live the dream and be able to do it. But this card is fucking terrible. This card is really, 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 really bad. I thought this would be a good one to trip you up with just because you get to rip your opponent's whole hand. And yeah, it's just something that really never happened. It's an older card, and getting 2 monsters on the field to sacrifice for this, and then hoping your opponent has nothing to interact with you, because I think one of the biggest differences is like we can interact on the opponent's turn, right? And so there are a myriad of cards that could stop this from happening so you don't lose your whole hand. And compared to Pokemon, like most of the time, your opponent's probably not going to have a full grip anyway. Like they may only have a couple cards regardless. So like you go through all these hoops, and if you only hand loop them for 3, was that really worth it? Like maybe that was game winning, but it's not like you're going to hit them for 5 or 6 every single time with this effect. Not to mention, there was definitely better things you could be doing than playing this card. If you're going to go through the effort of tribute summoning 2 monsters, which is something that even by GOAT format standards, you would rarely ever do. There was plenty of 2 tribute monsters that didn't have the restriction that says they could not be special summoned. And had much more powerful effects. Like there's one called Dark Magician of Chaos that on special summon just adds a spell card back to your hand. So it's like, oh, cool. I get a 2800 attacker that can add Graceful Charity back to my hand. That seems a lot better than hand ripping my opponent. Maybe hand ripping my opponent. So very funny card, very goofy card. A lot of people wanted it to work, and this is like a playground card for sure. People would definitely like get owned by this all the time, but this card is basically unplayable. So that was a fun one.
Makes sense. Fun one. So too costly to set up for the potential payoff. As long as your opponent knows what you're doing, it'll be basically not possible to ever do.
Yeah, and there's so many like generic options to remove this card, like just 1-for-1 removal. Like there's a card in GOAT format that just says, if your opponent declares an attack, flip this up, destroy that monster. So it's 1-for-1 removal, and your opponent used 3 cards to get Hino-Kagu-Tsuchi out. So you're totally happy if you're Sakuretsu armoring a Hino-Kagu-Tsuchi. And so it's even if it had the clause where it said, actually, no, I think if you could special summon it, it would be way better. The fact you can't special summon it either, you can't really like cheat it out. So I think that just makes it really difficult. We also have the reverse of this guy too, that instead of making your opponent discard their whole hand, you actually draw 5 cards if it deals battle damage.
Was that one also not good?
It was also not good. Yes, it was for you would think drawing 5 cards is crazy, but all the same reasons.
Hard.
Yeah, getting there is too hard. People wanted it to work. Trust me, people wanted it to work. Okay, this is a cool card. I'm curious your thoughts on this one.
All right, Prohibition. When you activate this card, declare 1 card name. Cards with that name and their effects can't be used. Cards on the field before this card was activated are not affected. You activate this card, declare 1 card name. Cards with that name and their effects cannot be used. Cards on the field before this card was activated are not affected.
So to clarify one thing, this is a continuous spell. So this would be like a one-sided stadium card.
I mean, that seems pretty good. If you just know what you're playing against, you just say, would that include monsters? Like, they wouldn't be able to activate any monster that you named? Or to only be
so
spells
Prohibition's
and
a weird card. It's had like some corrections in like how it works over time. But basically, if you declared a monster, they would not be able to even summon that monster to the field.
This seems kind of broken. That seems pretty. If you just play 3 of these and you open, if you open with 3 of these in your hand, could you play all 3 immediately? So you could just lock out 9 cards of your opponent's deck, the 9 most important cards of your opponent's deck. The question would just be like, you'd have to know what they're playing. But I assume Yu-Gi-Oh is pretty similar to most other card games, where once they play a card or 2, you have a rough idea of what's happening and what you're preparing to go up against, I assume. I mean, this card seems broken. It would be broken in Pokemon. It seems broken in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's probably
What would be
bad.
like the play pattern for this in Pokemon? Like, what would you be calling for the Pokemon viewers watching this?
Well, I think it would have to be limited to... You probably couldn't... This wouldn't be able to interact with Pokemon specifically, because that'd be too good then. So it would have to be... It would have to be like a one-sided stadium. Well, if it's a stadium card, it wouldn't be that good because your opponent could easily replace it. So it wouldn't be that good. If you played like... But it could be one of those things where like, I say that, but some of the most powerful cards in the past have been stadium cards, but you like play 4 of them. Like you max out your count. Like we recently had a card called Paths at the Peak, which shut down all abilities from all rule box Pokemon. And most Paths at the Peak decks played 4 Path because it is so easy to remove stadiums, but if you just do it over and over and over again, disrupt their hand a little bit maybe, then, you know, you get them to stick for a turn or 2, you can just win the game with that, right?
What about this? What if you tied this to the ability of like a bench supporter type Pokemon? So that way it's like your opponent can't easily remove it.
Then it would be insanely broken for sure. Well, it depends what you could limit. If you can't limit Pokemon and you were just like limiting trainers, like if you said...
Yeah, like say like
anything
besides Pokemon. Anything besides Pokemon.
Then it'd be interesting. It depends what stage of a Pokemon it would be. It depends if it's on a stage 1 or a stage 2, because that's a big limiting factor for setting Pokemon up and how powerful they can be, or how powerful they usually are in like a format or a meta.
Let's say stage 1.
Yeah, if it was on a stage 1 and you said like your opponent can't play Ultra Ball, that'd be pretty good. Or can't play Research, or can't play... I guess the biggest one would be like playing Iono's like the big hand disruption card in the format right now. So that'd be big. If you're playing an aggressive deck, you evolve to a stage 1 and say you can't play Iono for the rest of the game. Yeah, this would probably be a pretty good card in Pokemon. Maybe not broken. Would be really, really good. Seems really, really good. I'm going to go ahead and say this card is broken and was probably banned.
Prohibition is an interesting card. I think you are 100% correct about everything you said about this card. It's funny because on paper, this card seems like it would be broken, but in practice, it doesn't seem to play out the way that people want it to. I'm not sure what it is about Prohibition. There's always times, even in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, people have tried to sideboard this card thinking, oh, if I just Prohibition, you know, either their best monster that gets their whole combo started, or maybe their best answer to my board, hypothetically, then this card is broken. This card is crazy. And even, this is an old card as well. Older Yu-Gi-Oh!, they also tried to sideboard, sometimes even mainboard this card for that exact same reason. For whatever reason, this card just never comes to fruition, and it has just fallen by the wayside. It's a card that people always look to and they're like, damn, this card seems like it'd be really good. And then they try it and they're like, this is the worst card I've ever played, and they'll just stop. And it just never came to fruition. So funny to hear your take on it, because this card is, I don't want to say it's bad. I want to say it's like okay. There are probably a non-zero number of games where this card has maybe won a game for someone. There are so many better things you could be doing. Instead of playing a card that specifically stops one card from being played, we have, because we can interact on the opponent's turn and such, we have just cards that are omni-negates that can negate any type of card. So if you could negate any type of card reactively to what your opponent's doing, why would you proactively call something you think they're going to do when you can just react to it and ensure it's going to get negated, if that makes sense? And I think that's just kind of the big issue with this card.
That makes sense. So even there's just too many options. They still have too many options, even if you do limit what would be one of their more powerful options. Correct.
You would, like, what, compared to something like Prohibition, you'd rather have a card like Rivalry of Warlords that is going to stop one specific thing, and you know, especially coming out of the sideboard, that this card is designed to be played against, like, X deck. And that's a just much better way to go about it, instead of like calling the best card they might have and hoping that gets you there.
That makes sense. So a little bit too situational, or a little bit too broad of options to choose from.
Only a few left. This is going to be a fun one for you.
While your life points are lower than your opponent's, double the original attack of a monster equipped with this card. While your life points are higher, have the original attack.
So for a bit of context, this is an equip spell. I believe you guys have like items that you can put on your Pokemon. So I think this would be the equivalent of that. And since you don't have life points, we can say if you have less prize cards than your opponent instead of life points for this.
Yeah, so we currently have some tool cards. We actually have a tool card right now that says if your opponent has more prize or less prize cards remaining than you do 30 more damage.
Not double?
Not double. Yeah, so this would be broken in Pokemon for sure. Because we have
really?
Tool cards.
That's awesome.
This would be broken in Pokemon. Because like the comeback decks would play around this pretty heavily, and you could utilize it with, I mentioned the rule box Pokemon are worth multiple prize cards, non-rule box Pokemon are only worth one prize card, so you could make your non-rule box Pokemon way more powerful to be able to compete. So this would be broken in Pokemon for sure. In Yu-Gi-Oh! It definitely seems a lot more situational, although I could see it being, the thing is that it's like, it feels like you'd never want to play 3 of these, because it's like a comeback card. So drawing these in the early game would really slow you down and be really, really bad, and drawing it at the right time seems tough, although I guess I don't know how much like spell card search exists in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you could like just pull out a specific spell card you want on the turn you need it to like close out a game.
What if I show you this to equip Megamorph to? Does this change your mind?
Just how much attack it has?
Well, there's 8,000 life points in Yu-Gi-Oh! For context.
Yeah, so this would be like, I guess like I could see like some kind of combo deck where you just kind of you play through the game through like a more board control aspect, and then you go for a big one hit at some point. So I'm gonna say this card could be okay, but it's not. I don't think it's I don't think it's broken. So I don't think it was banned. It seems like maybe there's like a deck or two out there that like that's like a combo deck. Like that's just how you play through this card pretty heavily, control their board as much as possible, get to the end game, and then this comes down to close out a game. So maybe okay, but yeah, definitely not banned.
Let's talk about Megamorph. Megamorph is very funny. So in the OCG, that is our Asian territory. The OCG is separate from the TCG in respect to card releases. Their ban list is different. Everything happens in like Asia first, and then we get it a few months later. Yeah. And so Yu-Gi-Oh! Existed in Asia a few years before it existed for us here in the States. And so Megamorph was printed actually alongside the other card I showed you, the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. In the very early days, like you said, there was a combo deck where you could play another monster that would summon the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon out to the field. It would cheat it out effectively. You wouldn't have to summon it the way that it's supposed to be summoned. And because you had to pay life points to activate that effect, you then had lower life points than your opponent, assuming this is like the first turn of the game. So then you could activate Megamorph to equip it to the Ultimate Dragon and immediately just one-shot your opponent if you were going second. And this combo was so good by old Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards that they banned parts of the combo 5 days after they released some of these cards for people to play with them. Megamorph was obviously one of the key pieces of that combo, but it was never banned. I believe they only ever limited this card to 1 copy at worst, but it kind of sucked because people wanted to play with the combo and they never really got the chance to. Megamorph, like you said, it's a very situational card. By modern standards, this card is unplayable. By old Yu-Gi-Oh standards, it was fine. I don't think you would really go out of your way to play this card. I think it's kind of like what you said. If you have like some sort of like application for it, one thing you didn't pick up on is you can actually equip this to your opponent's monster, and if you you can make it weaker if you have the higher life point or the lower life points, however that works. But you can equip it to your opponent's monster as sort of like a pseudo removal card, so it has like some application outside of big thing hit face, which is what most people used it for.
Yeah,
but it was never like, it was like fine. I don't want to say it was like the worst card ever. If it was on the limited list, surely it couldn't have been that bad. But the big, just make a 9,000 attack dragon hit hard, that was the dream. It was something people didn't really get to do too often, but it was a very goofy card. A very goofy card. But my modern standards is just, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is hardly combat centric now, and I think that's one of the biggest differences between Yu-Gi-Oh! And like a lot of card games is that equip spells generally are just really bad because they just die with the monster, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Having so much removal and interaction, this has to be like the best equip card ever printed. Like, it has to say win the game, otherwise it's just not worth playing, and that's why Megamorph was good in the old days.
That makes sense. Yeah, because you're basically going 2 for 1, right? They're removing 2 of your cards for 1.
Precisely. So like, you better make sure that counts.
Yeah.
All right, getting into our last few here. This is going to be a fun one.
Both players unite all their respective cards on the field in their hands and in their graveyards with their respective decks and shuffle them. Both players draw 5 cards from their shuffled deck. So it just resets the game and nothing stays in play?
That is correct.
The fiber jar also goes back?
Yes, because I mentioned flip monsters earlier. So like I said, you would set this face down, and either if your opponent attacks into it, what happens is the monster gets flipped face up, which would then trigger the fiber jar to activate. Or if it survives, let's say your opponent just sets a card and passes, they don't attack you. On your turn, you could manually flip this card up and trigger the effect that way because you flip it face up.
So basically just resetting the game. In Pokemon, I think this would be really good because depending on how it would, because you could just play this as like a one of, pretty easy to find, and when all of a sudden you fall behind in the prize trade, you just activate this and you go, all right, let's go again. And theoretically,
now I think by Pokemon standards, you wouldn't reset the prizes because the life points still stay the same.
Oh, the life points stay the same. Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that everything on the board gets reset, but the life points remain the same.
That would still be pretty good in Pokemon, though, I feel like.
Okay.
Reset. Yeah, I feel like in Pokemon that would still be decent. Maybe it wouldn't be broken. It's such a weird card. Okay, so
is it like your oh shit button where it's like, oh, I'm behind, I need to like get back in it somehow?
Yeah, exactly. And that's like where the hand disruption comes in Pokemon usually to kind of slow your opponent down. So this would also be like another way to do that. I guess if you're playing a slower deck, it would be good. This card would be good as an aggressive deck versus other aggressive decks, I feel like. That's where it would be good.
Okay.
Or as an aggressive deck versus, I guess, it would just be good in aggressive decks. This would just be good in aggressive decks. It's like, okay, I can't win versus other aggressive decks. Let's go for a reset and hope I can cheese them. Or if you're playing against a more setup-based deck, you're like, okay, I took the first couple prize cards. Now let's go for a reset, de-evolve their whole board effectively, and then I'm a basic deck, so now I can ramp up so much faster, and I'll once again I get another, like usually the more aggressive basic decks, they draw the first couple prize cards, and then the evolution decks set up, and then they go back and forth from there. But if you just like draw the first couple prize cards and then immediately reset and then draw the first couple prize cards again, instead of having a 2 prize advantage, you have like a 4 prize advantage. So in aggressive decks, this seems broken. In Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm not sure. The life points staying the same would be the only thing that would make this card good, I feel like. I'm trying to come up with like scenarios in my head how this would even work. Like if you're ahead, if you're beating your opponent down, but you run out of resources, then you fiber jar to regain resources. If you're behind and your opponent's board is just so much better than yours, fiber jar and you'd reset the game to hopefully draw into just a better hand than your opponent, basically. The question would be like, how easy is it to negate this effect is like my big hang up for sure.
So I will say flip effects when monsters are battling them, they activate in a window that is very difficult to interact with if they can interact with it at all. That's just the way mechanical Yu-Gi-Oh works. However, if you were to flip this card manually yourself on your turn, it would be a lot easier to negate that effect.
Okay, what is the... what was my question with that? How scared are we of face-down monsters on our opponent's side of the field? Or do we usually just ignore them and swing over them?
So...
You can ignore them, right? Like you
Yeah,
can
I think it depends, because there are cards that can just straight up remove set monsters from the field. When there are set monsters that are present in the game, it is known, typically, especially at a higher competitive level, what those monsters probably are. However, if you don't have a way to deal with it, then it's like, okay, well, how am I going to address this board, essentially? And so that's where kind of the fun of Yu-Gi-Oh! With having like set cards is that there's that unknown information that you're working with.
Man, I guess one reason I could see this card being banned would just be that it made games take too long. Because it does kind of reset the whole game. So that's the reason I could see this card maybe being banned. Is just like, decks utilize it and just games went on forever. Overall, it just seems like a really cheesy card that probably doesn't amount to much once you get to those later game states. The only thing I can think of is like when you're ahead and if you run out of gas, use the fiber jar to reset. If your opponent just ignores it, yeah, it seems like a cheesy card because like it'd almost be like your opponent, you would have to play it hoping your opponent playing it, so then they attack into it. So I'm gonna go ahead and say this card is bad but fun or cheesy and wasn't banned.
Man, you were so close. You were so close. I've been waiting to put Fiber Jar in one of these videos because this is a very goofy card. This is an old card. This is a very goofy card that a lot of people just never really had the opportunity to play with because it was banned relatively quickly when it was like first around. I think it was like one of the first ban lists ever. Fiber Jar was on it, and it's been there ever since. So it is banned. But you hit the nail right on the head. It's banned because it's just fucking annoying. It's so annoying that every time the Fiber Jar flips, you have to go through this dance of, all right, I'm going to pick up all my cards, I'm going to reshuffle, and I'm going to draw 5 again, because the Fiber Jar also shuffles itself back into the deck as well, so they can keep just doing it again if they want to. It's not like the Fiber Jar removes itself from the deck. So it never ends. So it was limited before there was a ban list, and then eventually it got banned when there was actually a ban list. You're also able to tutor this card very easily from the deck. The main like search cards from around this time, if you remember like Sangan from GOAT format, for instance, can search this. So if you're in a pinch, it's like you kind of have like multiple copies of Fiber Jar if you need it. But if not, you just need the one copy, and then it's like you have multiple because at any time you can access it. And that's just kind of the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. But just an incredibly, incredibly annoying card to play against, because it's just like, all right, anytime I see a set monster, after I see Fiber Jar, it could just be Fiber Jar again. We're going to do this all over again. And by old Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards, that was just like not fun. I actually think if this card was like unbanned, I don't think this card would see play. I don't think it's very good because flip monsters are just very slow nowadays. There are still like a few decks that have like had flip based effects, but like the whole deck was sort of designed to do that. And Fiber Jar is just, I don't know. I don't think it could really cut it by modern standards. I think it could actually probably come off the list, but that might be a hot take in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community. So we'll see what the comments have to say about that. Okay,
so not like overly powerful, just annoying and maybe a little toxic because of that.
I would say it's powerful, like for all the reasons you mentioned, being able to reset the board, whether you're ahead or behind, depending on if you need more resources to close out a game if you're aggro, or if you're control, or like you're falling behind and you need to reset just to give yourself a fighting chance. I think it's still a good card in that regard, but I think nowadays Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just so fast that just like setting a Fiber Jar is not going to cut it. It's just, you're gonna die like 10 times out of 10 if that's all you're doing. So that, I mean, like that's just kind of the way the game has evolved. But it's, I think, just because of the way that this makes you play this like side quest of starting over, I think that would just be really annoying to have to do if that were to exist in the game. So that's probably why they just never want to unban this card. Alrighty, last card, and we saved the best for last.
I know about this card.
Oh, okay.
So we can still go through it if you want, unless you have a backup.
Sure. I can come up with a backup. I'm still curious to hear your thoughts, though.
Okay, painful choice. Select 5 cards from your deck. Show them to your opponent. Your opponent selects 1 card among them. Add that card to your hand. Discard the remaining cards to the graveyard. In Pokemon Standards, this probably wouldn't be great because there's just like better cards to play to find cards. And losing 4 cards wouldn't be great, especially because your opponent gets to kind of choose. Oh, wait, is this the card that I think I know about? Wait, this card seems super familiar. I'm pretty sure I know this card. And I'm like,
you might know.
Now I'm second guessing myself. Now I'm second guessing myself. Yeah. I mean, the big thing with this one is you're always going to be able to put cards in your discard pile. Your opponent will never be able to avoid you putting the cards you want in your discard pile, or in your graveyard, excuse me. In your graveyard, right? Because you can play 3 copies of your cards, so you take all 3 of those or whatever. Even if your opponent gives you 1 of them, the other 2 make it to your graveyard. So you just get to fuel your graveyard instantly with whatever you want in your graveyard to then interact with. And then you also get +1 card to your hand. So it's kind of going like a 1-for-1. So
it's a 1-for-1.
Yeah. Good card. banned.
How would this be in Pokemon?
Not very good. Not very good. Yeah. I don't think.
Just,
I'm trying to think. Oh, okay. That's not 100% true. So we used to have a card called in Pokemon. We used to have a card called Battle Compressor, which if it was an item card, I guess it would be good in some decks. It wouldn't be like broken and everything. We did have a card called Battle Compressor, which was an item card. You just search your deck for 3 cards and discarded it. And some decks did play that as like a 4 of. And as it rotated out of standard and the expanded format came around, a lot of decks started playing 4 of them. And there were some like pretty crazy decks where you could like basically put your whole deck in your discard pile or most of it, and there's a lot of ways to interact with cards from your discard pile. Like there was VS Seeker, which was an item card that got any supporter out of your discard pile. Yeah, in its time in standard, that was fine. Something like this in Pokemon, I think would be 5 cards is a lot, so being able to discard any 4 cards you want, even though and you only get to keep the 1, that would maybe be like too much. So maybe in some decks it would maybe be too much. But honestly, this card in Pokemon would honestly maybe be fine. The more I think about it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it would actually probably be decent in some decks. Yeah, decent in some decks, but not like an overly broken card or anything like that. All right, did I remember correctly about Painful Choice?
You did remember. You did remember. I was hoping you didn't see this card because it's always fun for people who have never seen this card before evaluating it. But this is probably single-handedly the most powerful card in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I don't think I'm the only person who believes that. And I think as the game has progressed and aged, it's only just gotten better, which is all the more reason why this card is never going to come off of the ban list. It's like you said, you're basically not giving your opponent much choice at all. Either you're having enough redundant effects off the Painful Choice that you're going to get what you want out of it, or the cards that are going to get sent are all going to have some value in the graveyard. So it's like, even though it's only a 1-for-1 on paper in terms of card economy, the other cards that might get sent might have some effect that gives you other cards anyway. So it could become like a +4 or potentially, even more than that at the end of the day. So the groaning faces, as you can see in the artwork, is how the opponent feels anytime that card gets played against them. So it's a very fitting card. It's aptly named and very banned. Very, very, very banned. I do have another backup one for you because this is maybe one of the goofiest Yu-Gi-Oh cards ever made. It's actually like very Pokemon inspired in a lot of ways now that I think about this. I'm going to apologize. This card has a lot of text, but I can't wait to see your reaction to this one.
All right, let's see what we got here. Last turn. I don't know this card, but I've seen the artwork. I don't know. It was like maybe.
Well, you've seen one of the guys on the artwork already.
Oh, that's true. Maybe that's actually what I'm familiar with. All right, and I gotta blow this up a little bit.
Yeah, blow this one up. This is a lot of text on this one.
Last turn, this card can only be activated during your opponent's turn when your life points are 1,000 or less. Select one monster.
So let's assume in this case you have only 1 prize card by Pokemon standards.
Yeah, could you have 0?
You can't have 0. You have to still have some life points.
Okay.
Because otherwise, if you have 0, you lose.
Select one monster on your side of the field and send all other cards on the field and in their respective owner's hands to their respective graveyards. After that, your opponent selects and special summons one monster from his or her deck in face-up attack position and attacks your selected monster. Any battle damage from this battle is treated as 0. The player whose monster remains alone on the field at the end of this turn wins the duel. Any other case results in a draw. Oh, man. So, if I understand this correctly, if you have 1,000 or less life points, you pick one of your monsters. All other cards on the field go to the graveyards, and then your opponent special summons one monster from their deck in face-up attack position. Both the monsters battle, and then whatever monster wins leads to that person winning. So that's a lot. It feels like if you...
It's cool though, right?
It's cool. It's cool. I feel like if you know your opponent... I'm trying to think about this. Let's tackle this Pokemon terms first, I guess.
Sure.
If this was in Pokemon, you'd select one of your Pokemon to stay and play.
Sorry if this is in Pokemon.
Everything else goes to the... This would probably be really, really good in Pokemon, for sure.
Interesting.
Well, Pokemon's...
Why do you say that?
I guess it wouldn't really work in Pokemon as is, because to set up a Pokemon, you need to attach energy to it. So if your opponent is just taking a Pokemon out of their deck, it wouldn't have anything to be able to attack with. But I guess if you just said your opponent takes any Pokemon, even an evolution Pokemon, and puts it in their active spot and can use any attack on that Pokemon, then...
Sure, let's go with that. Yeah. Let's go with that.
So that would make it really easy to tech against this card, because you'd both be playing... Your opponent would just play, like, some stupid Pokemon that's terrible otherwise, that maybe has a really powerful attack that's impossible to set up, and they would just beat you with it. So, but you'd make your opponent tech for you, I guess.
Okay. Okay.
So I think this would
now
be
remember, you can only use this if you have one prize card in your Pokemon
True.
example.
So yeah, your opponent.
I'm not sure if you're building around that or if that plays into your calculus at all here. Just curious.
That would also have to be part of it as well. And if you have one prize card left, you probably could just draw the last prize card in a different way. So this card, I would actually think about it more. This card would be terrible in Pokemon because you could just draw your one prize card just by knocking out one of your other opponent's Pokemon, probably. So you don't have to go through this whole roundabout thing. So this card is like super specific, and if your opponent knows you have this, I would imagine they could pretty easily play around it because they could just not put you at 1,000 life points. But I guess the question would be, can you put yourself at 1,000 life points easily? And like, could you utilize? So trap cards have to be set for a turn.
That is correct, yes. You set during your turn, at any point after you pass play back to your opponent, it can be used at any point, assuming the conditions are met.
So on your, let's say you set this turn 1, on your second turn, could you play enough cards that would put you down to 1,000 life points, pass to your opponent, and then immediately when your opponent draws for turn, when does an opponent's turn start? When they draw?
When they draw, yes.
So would they draw and you could immediately flip last turn and then activate it?
Hypothetically. And
the question would just be, and you can you counter trap spell cards? You can, right? Mm-hmm. So the question would just be, do they have a counter to your trap card? And it would be pretty obvious what you're doing, I feel like, as well with this card. If that's what you did, was like, try and get decent monster into play, put myself down to 1,000 life points, go, set trap card, go. So I'm going to go ahead and say this is like too specific, but I could see other cards around it. If there's enough other cards around this that just amplified this card, it could have been to the point where it was broken. But I'm going to go ahead and say this card is bad because it's too specific and wasn't banned.
Let's talk about last turn. I think this is a good way to end the video since it has last in the name. So last turn, similar to Fiber Jar, is just like one of the weirdest cards ever printed. Not even just for Yu-Gi-Oh! I think for like any card game. This is probably up there as one of the weirdest cards of all time. So I always love showing this card to people. So I'm actually glad you knew Painful Choice because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten to do this. So you actually hit the nail right on the head. So when it comes to last turn, what you're trying to do is you're basically playing a deck designed to take advantage of this card, and there's a lot of ways that you can do that. So you mentioned getting your life points down to 1,000 so that you can activate last turn. Well, you don't even have to wait, hypothetically, until your second turn. You could do it on the first turn with this card right here. Why don't you give this card a read?
All right, Wall of Revealing Light. Activate by paying any multiple of 1,000 life points. Monsters your opponent's control cannot attack if their attack is less than or equal to the amount you paid.
So hypothetically, on your turn 1, you could set both of these cards face down, and then during your opponent's turn, as soon as they draw, activate Wall of Revealing Life, pay 7,000 life points. You don't care about the effect of this card. You're just using this to pay 7,000 life points. And now you're at 1,000 or less, so you can flip up last turn. But now you're probably wondering, okay, how am I going to win the game with this card? Well, there's a little card that was also printed around this time called Jowgen the Spiritualist. Why don't you give this card a read?
You can discard one random card from your hand to to the graveyard.
Yep.
Destroy all special summoned monsters on the field. Neither player can special summon monsters. Like for the rest of the until this leaves.
The way this works is that because Jowgen the Spiritualist would be on the field and you set your 2 trap cards, your opponent's turn comes, you activate the wall, pay 7,000, you're down to 1,000. You activate last turn. You send everything else to the field on the field to the graveyard aside from your Jowgen. But because Jowgen has a continuous effect that reads neither player can special summon monsters, your opponent is not allowed to special summon a monster out of their deck. And yeah, that's the last turn combo. And there was other like just dumb gimmicky things. The biggest thing about this card is that there's so much text on it and it never actually plays out the way anyone thinks it does. There's actually a 16-page document on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki that talks about all the interactions and rulings surrounding last turn. And this is just a card that is such a colossal headache that Konami's like, we're just going to ban this because we never want to deal with this card ever again. And that's the legacy of last turn. It is a very goofy card. It is very Yu-Gi-Oh! In nature and is banned. It is banned for 20 years and it's probably never going to be released because of how stupid it is.
So they just overcooked on this one, it looks like.
They were not even in the kitchen. That's how far they were gone. They were gone. So what do you think about Yu-Gi-Oh? What do you think?
I mean, it's definitely interesting. It's definitely a game. I always say this about Yu-Gi-Oh! And even Magic. Or even some of like the more recent games. I almost went and played in like a Flesh and Blood tournament, but the decks are just way too expensive for that game, so I didn't end up doing that. But yeah, the biggest thing for me has always just been time. It's definitely a game I want to sink some time into and actually play with. I mean, it's got the online client, so it's pretty accessible, right? But yeah, time is always just kind of the biggest thing for me. There's always things moving and happening in the Pokemon TCG that I'm keeping up to date with, especially being a at least up till this upcoming season, a full-time competitor. So maybe this is like the year where, or I guess I kind of think more in terms of Pokemon seasons, which end in August and start like a month after that. I don't really think in years, but Pokemon seasons. So maybe this upcoming season I'll actually find some time to put some time to you, because it's definitely an interesting game. Everything I've seen from it and played with it definitely intrigues me. So it's definitely something I want to put more time into for sure. Yeah.
What was your favorite card that I showed you?
Man, I mean, probably the Fiber Jar. It's just such a weird card. And yeah, I didn't think it was that good. I thought it was like super cheesy, but it was apparently just good enough to like play, and then, you know, too annoying and good enough to be banned as well. So yeah, probably the Fiber Jar. It's just such a weird card.
It is a weird card. It's a very weird card. A lot of the cards I showed you are old, and old Yu-Gi-Oh cards specifically. I imagine Pokemon's probably similar. A lot of old cards are just very weird because I don't think they really knew what this game was going to be yet. So.
Yeah, old Pokemon cards are just super simple. Like, there's like not as much going. Oh, actually, that's not true. Like old Pokemon cards, like base set is like super simple, super straightforward. It got a lot more weird and interactive, like 2006.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I'm sure everyone enjoyed seeing a Pokemon master such as yourself evaluating some of Yu-Gi-Oh's finest cards. I'll have all your info down in the description. Thanks so much for joining me.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
So guys, that's going to wrap it up for another video. I really hope you all enjoyed. Let's go ahead and shout the patrons for all of their continued support. So shout out to Shadow1317, Sim00x3, MBT Play Medolce, Moto, Cameron L. Smith, The Synchro Guy, Pony Stark, Dan the Man Hoban, Little Fadeleaf, Draconic, Dylan Rare Hunter, JW11860, Brian Dancer of Class 7, Flannel Daddy, Twinkle Muncher, literally all of the guinea pigs, Cheeks McLapperty, Stolfin Amethyst, Wonder Waffle, MBT canceled by community soon, canceled by all committee soon, canceled by all players soon, Corvain, absolute angriest peacock of the Edison Club, Daniel Howell, and life keeps using solemn judgment on my hopes and dreams. Thank you all so much again for watching, and we will see you next time.